Before Sumer built its first ziggurat, before Egypt carved its first hieroglyph, there existed a world we have forgotten. Its memory survives not in monuments, but in numbers. Mathematical patterns preserved across cultures that describe cycles of time far older than recorded history. These numbers appear in king lists, in astronomical texts, in the dimensions of ancient temples. They suggest that civilization's story does not begin where we think it does. It begins in the silence before the flood. Around 3300 BC, the Sumerian civilization emerged in southern Mesopotamia with a sophistication that defies conventional models of cultural development. The archaeological record shows no gradual progression from simple to complex. Instead, cities like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur appear suddenly with multi-story temples, standardized measurement systems, and urban planning that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Their earliest artifacts display technical mastery rather than experimental learning. Their mathematics included the base 60 system still used for measuring time and angles. Their astronomical observations tracked celestial movements with precision, sufficient to predict eclipses and document the precession of the equinoxes. A cycle lasting 25,920 years that requires centuries of continuous observation to detect. As you drift between memory and silence, consider, if catastrophe came tomorrow, what knowledge would you carve in stone? Tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and whether your world is waking or resting. If these warnings from the forgotten world resonated, gently tap like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let the questions linger. Let the ancient numbers settle. What makes this emergence particularly striking is what isn't there. Most civilizations leave behind clear developmental stages, crude tools, giving way to refined instruments, simple structures evolving into complex architecture. The Sumerian record shows none of this expected progression. Their cuneiform writing appears fully formed. Their bronze metallurgy demonstrates optimal alloy ratios. Their urban design incorporates hydraulic engineering principles that rival modern civil engineering. The city of Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BC, housed 50,000 inhabitants across residential, commercial, and religious districts connected by canals, serving both transportation and sanitation. The knowledge required to build and maintain such infrastructure suggests inheritance rather than invention. The Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple tablets from different periods, presents one of history's most perplexing documents. It divides Sumerian rulers into two distinct eras, those who reigned before a great flood and those who came after. The pre-flood section records something that shouldn't be possible. 8 kings are listed with reigns measured not in decades or centuries, but in tens of thousands of years. Alalim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. The combined duration totals 241,200 years. After these entries, the text states simply, "Then the flood swept over, and the kingship descended from heaven." Following this event, the recorded reigns drop dramatically, though still extraordinary by modern standards. Etana of Kish, 1,560 years. Meskiagasha of Uruk, 324 years. Traditional interpretation dismisses these extended reigns as mythological exaggeration or symbolic representations of dynasties. But this explanation fails to account for the mathematical precision with which these numbers are recorded. The pre-flood reigns are all multiples of 3,600, a number the Sumerians called a sar. This base unit appears consistently throughout Sumerian mathematics and astronomy. The precision suggests these weren't arbitrary figures, but calculated periods based on specific measurements. The numbers follow patterns that correspond to astronomical cycles known to modern science, but supposedly unknown to ancient observers. The same numerical patterns appear far beyond Mesopotamia. Hindu cosmology records cycles of 432,000 years. Greek tradition describes ages lasting 12,960 years. Egyptian priest astronomers tracked stellar movements over periods spanning thousands of years. These cultures, separated by geography and language, preserved identical or proportional numbers in their sacred texts and architectural proportions. The repetition suggests transmission of knowledge rather than coincidental invention. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of sophisticated cultures predating Sumer by millennia. At Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, massive stone circles dating to 9600 BC display astronomical alignments and artistic sophistication that required organizational capabilities beyond what we associate with Neolithic hunter-gatherers. The site was deliberately buried around 800 BC, preserved as if intended for future discovery. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, stone arrangements dating to 6500 BC align with summer solstices and track the same precessional cycles recorded in later Sumerian astronomy. These monuments demonstrate that someone possessed advanced astronomical knowledge thousands of years before civilization supposedly began. The flood narratives themselves appear across every inhabited continent with remarkable consistency. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, Mesoamerican, and Pacific Island traditions all describe catastrophic inundation, divine warnings, survival vessels, and the preservation of sacred knowledge. The accounts share specific details that suggest common memory rather than independent invention. Geological evidence confirms that massive flooding occurred at the end of the last ice age between 11,000 and 8,000 BC, when melting glaciers raised sea levels by more than 300 feet. Entire coastal regions vanished, including Doggerland between Britain and Europe, the Sunda Shelf connecting Southeast Asian islands, and the Persian Gulf basin, which was once a fertile river valley. Any civilizations inhabiting these lowlands would have been completely submerged, their memory surviving only through the accounts of those who escaped to higher ground. Sumerian tablets describe beings called the Apkallu, 7 sages who came before the flood and taught humanity the fundamentals of civilization. These weren't depicted as mythological gods, but as historical figures with specific roles. Egyptian texts reference the Shemsu Hor, or followers of Horus, who preserved knowledge through catastrophe. Indian Vedic literature describes the Sapta Rishi, 7 sages who transmitted wisdom across cosmic cycles. Greek tradition recorded the story of Atlantis not as Plato's invention, but as an account transmitted through Egyptian priests who claimed their records extended 9,000 years before Solon's time. These keeper traditions share a common function: the preservation and transmission of knowledge through catastrophe. The consistency across cultures suggests a real practice: priesthoods and scribal classes deliberately encoding information in durable forms, numbers preserved in myth, astronomical knowledge embedded in monument alignments, agricultural techniques transmitted through ritual. These weren't superstitions, but survival strategies designed to ensure that if civilization collapsed, the blueprint for rebuilding would remain. The precision of ancient astronomical knowledge reveals how this preservation worked. The Great Pyramid at Giza aligns to true north within 1/15 of a degree. The three main pyramids mirror the arrangement of stars in Orion's belt as they appeared in 10,500 BC. Stonehenge tracks not just solar and lunar movements, but the 56-year eclipse cycle. The Mayan calendar calculated the length of the solar year to within seconds of modern measurements. These achievements required centuries of continuous observation and mathematical calculation, suggesting far older traditions than the monuments themselves. The recurring numbers encoded across cultures demonstrate deep time measurement. The number 72 appears in mythologies worldwide, the number of years required for the equinox sunrise to shift 1 degree due to precession. Multiply by 360 degrees, 25,920 years, one complete precessional cycle. The Sumerian Sar of 3,600 years equals 50 cycles of 72. The Hindu Kali Yuga of 432,000 years equals 600 Sars. These aren't coincidental. They represent a shared system for tracking cosmic time. What emerges from this evidence isn't a simple story of primitive peoples gradually discovering technology. Instead, the record suggests cycles of development, catastrophe, and rebuilding. Civilizations rose to levels of sophistication sufficient to track stellar movements over millennia, then collapsed due to environmental catastrophe. Survivors preserved fragments of knowledge through oral tradition, architectural encoding, and numerical systems designed to survive the loss of context. When conditions stabilized, this inherited knowledge allowed rapid reconstruction, explaining why civilizations like Sumer appear suddenly without developmental stages. The question becomes not whether advanced societies existed before recorded history, but how many cycles of rise and collapse preceded the civilizations we remember. The geological record shows Earth has experienced repeated catastrophic events: asteroid impacts, volcanic super-eruptions, rapid climate shifts, massive flooding. Each would have devastated human populations and destroyed material culture. But if survivors possessed preserved knowledge, star maps, agricultural techniques, mathematical systems, architectural principles, they could rebuild quickly once conditions allowed. This cyclical model appears throughout ancient texts. Hindu cosmology describes repeating ages of enlightenment and darkness. Greek tradition recorded ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each ending in destruction. Norse mythology described worlds destroyed and reborn. Rather than dismissing these as primitive superstition, we might recognize them as cultural memory of real events, compressed into mythic narrative but preserving essential truth. The implications reach beyond academic revision of timelines. If civilization has risen and fallen before, if knowledge has been lost and rediscovered in cycles, then the trajectory we assume, steady progress from primitive origins to modern sophistication, may be an illusion. We may instead inhabit a temporary peak between catastrophes, as our predecessors did. The ancient texts' warning of cyclical destruction might not be myth, but recorded experience, encoded by those who survived previous collapses and wanted their descendants to understand the pattern. The monuments, the numbers, the flood narratives, the keeper traditions, all point toward a civilization that recognized its own fragility. A civilization that understood knowledge could be lost and deliberately created systems to preserve it. The megalithic sites weren't just temples, but archives in stone. The astronomical numbers weren't religious symbolism, but scientific data. The myths weren't fantasy, but compressed history. We stand at a moment when technology allows us to rediscover what ancient cultures encoded. Satellite archaeology reveals submerged structures along continental shelves. Ice cores preserve evidence of rapid climate shifts. Genetic studies trace human migrations that match ancient flood narratives. Astronomical software can reconstruct ancient skies and verify alignments described in texts. The evidence confirms what mythology preserved. Human history extends far deeper than conventional chronology suggests. The story of civilization begins not in Sumer, but in the world Sumer inherited. Fragments of knowledge passed through catastrophe by those determined that memory should survive. To understand where we came from, we must first understand what was forgotten, and why certain knowledge was deemed worth preserving through the collapse of entire worlds. The marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers hold secrets buried beneath millennia of sediment. To understand what Sumer inherited, we must first examine what existed in Mesopotamia before history officially began, and why the archaeological silence speaks louder than the ruins themselves. Between 4500 and 3300 BC, something happened in southern Mesopotamia that archaeology cannot adequately explain. Not a gradual accumulation of knowledge, but an absence, followed by sudden presence. The period immediately preceding Sumer's emergence shows scattered settlements, simple pottery, basic agriculture. Then, within a span of perhaps 3 generations, the entire region transforms. Cities rise. Writing appears. Bronze metallurgy begins, not as experimental attempts, but as established practices. The conventional narrative describes this as the birth of civilization. But birth implies development, infancy, adolescence, maturation. The Sumerian record shows none of these stages. It shows arrival. Consider what archaeologists find in the lowest levels of Eridu, traditionally considered Sumer's oldest city. The earliest temple there, dating to 5400 BC, already demonstrates architectural principles that should have required centuries to develop. The structure uses standardized mud bricks, not irregular stones or packed earth, but uniform blocks manufactured to specific dimensions. The building incorporates load-bearing walls, drainage channels, and foundation techniques. These aren't innovations being tested, they're established methods being applied. The settlement patterns themselves reveal the anomaly. Before 3500 BC, Mesopotamian sites show typical Neolithic characteristics: small populations, informal layouts, gradual expansion. After 3300 BC, the region contains planned cities with populations in the tens of thousands. The transition isn't gradual, it's categorical, as if the knowledge required to organize, feed, and govern large populations simply materialized. Writing presents the same problem. Cuneiform doesn't evolve from simpler systems. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dating to 3200 BC, already employ sophisticated grammatical structures and abstract concepts. They record not just counts of grain or livestock, but administrative hierarchies, legal transactions, astronomical observations. The script appears fully capable of expressing complex thought. Where are the centuries of development that such sophistication requires? Where are the crude attempts, the experimental symbols, the gradual refinement? They don't exist. Metallurgy tells an identical story. Bronze working requires specific knowledge. Copper and tin must be combined in precise ratios, heated to exact temperatures, worked at particular stages of cooling. The process demands understanding gained through extensive trial and error. Yet, Sumerian bronze work from the earliest period shows optimal alloy compositions. The craftsmen weren't learning, they were executing established techniques. The mathematics compound the mystery. The base 60 system Sumer used wasn't simple counting. It enabled calculation of areas, volumes, compound interest, reciprocals. It incorporated place value notation, a concept that wouldn't reappear in human mathematics until the medieval period. The system's sophistication suggests long development. The archaeological record provides no time for that development to occur. Mainstream archaeology explains this through the concept of rapid cultural diffusion, the idea that once key innovations appear, they spread and build upon each other quickly. But this model requires an origin point, a place where the initial innovations developed gradually. For Sumer, no such origin point exists. The knowledge seems to arrive complete, as if imported from somewhere or somewhen else. The region itself offers clues to what might have been lost. Modern geological surveys reveal that Mesopotamia's landscape has changed dramatically since the end of the Ice Age. Between 9500 and 6500 BC, the Persian Gulf extended much farther inland than it does today. What is now desert and marshland was then a vast river valley, lush and fertile, fed by rivers that no longer exist. Settlements along that valley floor would have been obliterated by rising waters as glaciers melted. Any evidence of earlier development would lie beneath hundreds of feet of sediment or under the waters of the Gulf itself. Core samples from the Persian Gulf basin show something unexpected. In layers dating between 7500 and 6500 BC, the sediment contains pollen from cultivated plants, wheat, barley, date palms, in concentrations that suggest organized agriculture. This predates Sumerian cities by 3,000 years. It indicates that someone was farming the region long before history records any civilization there. Then the layer ends, the flooding begins. And after a gap of millennia, Sumer appears. The Sumerian texts themselves acknowledge this gap. Their creation myths don't describe gods forming civilization from nothing. They describe gods restoring what had been lost, rebuilding what the flood destroyed, reteaching what humanity had forgotten. The language consistently references a prior state, a world that existed before and had to be recreated. One tablet from Nippur preserves a fragment that translates, "After the waters receded, after the land emerged from the deep, after mankind had increased, after the cities had been built again." The word "again" appears in the original text. Not built, but built again. This phrasing appears throughout Sumerian literature, not as poetic device, but as historical reference. The archaeological silence before Sumer may not represent absence of civilization. It may represent erasure, the physical destruction of evidence by flooding so complete that only fragments survived in elevated areas or were transmitted through memory. The scattered Neolithic settlements archaeology does find might not be humanity's first attempts at agriculture and permanent habitation. They might be refugee camps, the desperate rebuilding efforts of populations displaced by catastrophe, carrying with them incomplete memories of more sophisticated societies that existed in regions now underwater. If this interpretation holds, then Sumer wasn't the beginning of civilization. It was civilization's continuation after interruption, knowledge preserved imperfectly by survivors and reapplied once conditions stabilized. The sudden appearance of complexity wasn't innovation, it was reconstruction. The question, then, shifts. We stop asking how primitive people developed civilization so quickly. We begin asking what level of sophistication existed before the flood, who preserved the knowledge through catastrophe, and how much was lost in the transmission. The timeline doesn't begin at 3300 BC. It breaks there, a visible resumption point following an invisible collapse. The marshlands hold their silence. But beneath the sediment, beneath the water, beneath the accepted chronology, something waits. Not the origin of civilization, but its ghost. The shadow of a world that existed before history learned to write itself down. And in the sudden sophistication of Sumer, in the complete knowledge appearing without precedent, we may be seeing not humanity's first achievement, but its second attempt. In the ruins of Uruk, archaeologists discovered something that violates every model of technological progression. A clay cone, inscribed and dated to 3100 BC, records the completion of the city's main temple complex. The text describes not construction techniques being developed, but construction standards being maintained. The language assumes knowledge already possessed, methods already established. It reads like a quality control report, not an innovation record. This is the problem with Sumer. Everything functions as if civilization had been operating for centuries. Yet the physical evidence suggests it had barely begun. Uruk itself demonstrates the impossibility. By 3200 BC, the city covered nearly 250 hectares. Its walls, built from millions of standardized bricks, stretched 9 kilometers in circumference. Within those walls stood the Arna district, a sacred precinct containing multiple temples, administrative buildings, and workshops arranged according to a coherent master plan. The entire complex required coordinated labor from thousands of workers, sophisticated logistics to supply materials, and architectural knowledge to ensure structural stability. Cities this large shouldn't exist yet. not according to conventional models of urban development, which require centuries of gradual population growth, incremental improvements in food production, and slow accumulation of organizational knowledge. Uruk appears to have bypassed these requirements entirely. The city didn't grow. It was founded at scale. The same pattern emerges at Eridu, located 60 kilometers southwest. Excavations reveal 17 successive temple levels, each built directly atop the previous structure. The earliest level, dating to 5400 BC, already incorporates architectural elements that define Mesopotamian sacred architecture for the next 3,000 years: a central altar, symmetrical layout, and precise cardinal alignment. These aren't primitive experiments. They're expressions of established tradition. But tradition requires time to form. Where is that time? At Ur, the royal cemetery reveals metalwork that shouldn't be achievable in the early Bronze Age. Gold helmets beaten to uniform thickness. Lapis lazuli inlays requiring precision cutting tools. Silver vessels with soldered joints showing mastery of temperature control. The craftsmanship indicates not early attempts at metallurgy, but mature artistic and technical traditions. The objects date to 2600 BC, yet display sophistication associated with cultures 1,000 years more advanced. The irrigation systems present perhaps the clearest anomaly. By 3300 BC, Sumer had constructed an extensive network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs that controlled water flow across hundreds of square kilometers. These weren't simple ditches. They were engineered waterways with calculated gradients, regulated flow rates, and coordinated operation requiring centralized planning. The mathematics necessary to design such systems, calculating water volume, channel capacity, and seasonal variation, represent advanced hydraulic engineering. Modern civil engineers examining the canal systems note something disturbing. The earliest canals show the same level of sophistication as later ones. There's no learning curve visible in the archaeological record. The first irrigation projects demonstrate complete understanding of the principles involved. It's as if Sumerian engineers inherited a manual and followed it, rather than discovering techniques through trial and error. The cuneiform tablets from Uruk's Iana district provide the documentary evidence of this impossible sophistication. The earliest examples, dating to 3200 BC, already employ a complex system of logograms and phonetic signs capable of recording abstract concepts. The tablets document temple inventories, ration distributions, and commercial transactions using standardized formats. They reference professional specializations, scribes, overseers, craftsmen, implying established hierarchies and division of labor. But writing this sophisticated requires a lengthy developmental period. Other writing systems, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese characters, Mesoamerican glyphs, all show clear evolution from pictographic origins to phonetic writing over centuries. Cuneiform lacks this evolutionary sequence. The earliest examples already function as complete writing systems. The mathematics encoded in these tablets compound the mystery. Sumerian scribes calculated using the base 60 system with full understanding of place value notation. They computed areas of irregular fields, volumes of granaries, and compound interest on loans. Administrative texts from Shuruppak, dating to 2600 BC, demonstrate multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, and solutions to quadratic equations. This represents mathematical sophistication that Europe wouldn't achieve until the Renaissance. The weights and measures reveal coordination across impossible distances. Throughout Mesopotamia, from the earliest Sumerian period, standardized units appear. The shekel for weight, the cubit for length, the gur for volume. These weren't approximate measurements that varied by region. They were precise, uniform standards maintained across dozens of independent city-states. Archaeological samples of Sumerian weights show variance of less than 1% across 300 kilometers. This level of standardization requires centralized authority and regular verification, institutions that shouldn't exist yet. The astronomical observations push the anomaly further. Cuneiform tablets record the movements of Venus with precision sufficient to predict its cycles. They document eclipse patterns, planetary conjunctions, and the heliacal rising of specific stars. These observations required decades of continuous recording and mathematical analysis to achieve. Yet they appear in texts from the earliest literate period, as if the observation program had been ongoing long before anyone learned to write it down. The calendar itself demonstrates inherited knowledge. The Sumerian year consisted of 12 lunar months, with periodic intercalation of a 13th month to maintain alignment with solar seasons. This lunisolar calendar requires understanding of both lunar cycles, 29.5 days, and the solar year, 365.25 days. Calculating when to add the extra month demands mathematical sophistication and long-term astronomical observation. Yet, the Sumerians employed this calendar from the moment writing appears, suggesting the underlying astronomical knowledge predated literacy by considerable time. City planning reveals the same pattern of complete knowledge from the beginning. Sumerian cities weren't organic settlements that grew irregularly. They followed deliberate layouts with distinct zones for residential, commercial, religious, and administrative functions. Streets ran in roughly orthogonal grids. Drainage systems carried waste away from living areas. Public squares provided gathering spaces. This level of urban design requires understanding principles of sanitation, traffic flow, and social organization, understanding supposedly gained only through centuries of urban experience. Gradual development models fail here because they require something the archaeological record doesn't provide: time. If Sumer developed these capabilities through normal technological progression, we should find evidence of simpler predecessors, trial versions of canals, early attempts at standardization, crude astronomical records, experimental urban layouts. Instead, we find mature systems operating from the moment they become visible. It's as if someone pressed pause on an advanced civilization, waited millennia, then pressed play. The only model that accommodates this evidence is inheritance. Sumer didn't invent these technologies and systems. It received them, transmitted across some gap we can't yet map, preserved by means we don't yet understand, from a source that left no ruins we've recognized. The sophistication isn't impossible, the suddenness is. And if Sumer inherited its knowledge, the question becomes, from where? From whom? And what happened to the civilization capable of developing what Sumer merely preserved? The tablets offer no direct answer. But they do offer something else. Records of time measured in scales that dwarf human memory, suggesting those who taught Sumer had been watching the sky far longer than history should allow. The Weld Blundell Prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a clay column inscribed around 270 BC. It contains a list of Sumerian rulers spanning what the text claims is 241,200 years of kingship before a catastrophic flood, followed by 24,510 years after. The document is not unique. Fragments of the same list appear on tablets from Nippur, Larsa, and Isin, spanning 700 years of copying. Each version records the same impossible chronology. Scholars treat this as mythology. The numbers are too large, the reigns too long, the timeline too vast. But mythology doesn't explain why scribes across centuries copied these figures with mathematical precision, or why the numbers follow patterns that encode astronomical cycles modern science only recently rediscovered. The king list divides history at a singular event, the flood. Before this boundary, 8 rulers are named, each reigning for periods measured in tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. The final antediluvian king, Ubatutu of Shuruppak, ruled for 18,600 years. Then the text states, "The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven." Following this event, the recorded reigns drop precipitously. Etana of Kish, 1,560 years. Meskiagasher of Uruk, 324 years. By the time the list reaches historically verified rulers around 2600 BC, the reign lengths match archaeological evidence. Gilgamesh of Uruk, 126 years. The document transitions from impossible to plausible, but never explains the discontinuity. Standard interpretation dismisses the antediluvian section as purely mythological, either symbolic representations of dynasties rather than individuals, or religious exaggeration meant to glorify ancient kingship. This explanation assumes the Sumerians, meticulous record keepers who tracked grain inventories to the bushel and calculated compound interest, suddenly abandoned precision when recording their own history. It assumes scribes who standardized weights across hundreds of kilometers simply invented random large numbers for their most sacred chronologies. The assumption fails when the mathematics are examined. Every antediluvian reign is a multiple of 3,600. The Sumerian Sar, Alulim, 8 Sars, Alalgar, 10 Sars, Enmenluana, 12 Sars. This isn't symbolic exaggeration, it's calculated periodization using a specific base unit. The precision suggests measurement, not invention. The Sar itself reveals the sophistication involved. 3,600 appears throughout Sumerian mathematics and astronomy as a fundamental unit for measuring large cycles. It equals 60 squared, the base of their numerical system extended to its second power. In astronomical terms, 3,600 years approximates 5 precessional degrees, 1/72 of the complete cycle through which the equinox sunrise shifts against the background stars. The Sumerians were measuring time in units derived from cosmic motion. The total antediluvian chronology, 241,200 years, equals 67 SARs. This number doesn't appear random. 67 is prime, suggesting intentional selection rather than rounded estimation. More significantly, 241,200 years equals approximately 9 complete precessional cycles of 25,920 years. Whether this correspondence is coincidental or deliberate, it demonstrates that whoever established these chronologies understood cycles vastly longer than human lifespans. The post-flood kings introduce a different pattern. Their reigns, while still extraordinary, follow different mathematical relationships. The numbers frequently appear as multiples of 600, 60, or 12. Etana's 1,560 years equals 26 periods of 60. Enmerkar's 420 years equals 7 periods of 60. The mathematical structure persists, but the scale shifts. Whatever the king list is recording changes after the flood. Comparative mythology deepens the mystery. Hindu texts describe the Kali Yuga, the current age of the world, as lasting 432,000 years. This equals 120 SARs. The complete cycle of 4 yugas totals 4,320,000 years, 1,200 SARs. Egyptian sources, as recorded by Greek historians, claimed their civilization extended back tens of thousands of years through dynasties of gods, demigods, and mortal rulers. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BC, recorded that before the flood, 10 kings ruled for a combined 432,000 years, the exact duration of the Kali Yuga. These correspondences across cultures separated by geography and language suggest transmission of a common framework. The numbers aren't independent inventions. They're variations on a shared system for periodizing vast spans of time. And the consistency with which they appear in sacred chronologies suggests they held significance beyond mythological storytelling. Modern attempts to rationalize these figures typically propose that each year represents a shorter unit, perhaps a month or a season. This would reduce Al-Ulim's 28,800 years to a more reasonable 2,400 years if each year equals 1 month. But this interpretation collapses when applied consistently. The post-flood kings would then have impossibly short reigns. Etana's 1,560 years becoming 130 years, which matches historical possibility, but later kings like Enma-Baragesi, who archaeological evidence confirms ruled around 2600 BC, would have reigned only 10 years using the same conversion. The tablets would be internally inconsistent. They aren't. The numbers maintain mathematical relationships, whether measuring antediluvian or historical periods. Another possibility emerges when considering what the king list might actually be recording. If these aren't individual rulers, but astronomical cycles personified, the numbers become comprehensible. 28,800 years approximates the time required for specific stellar configurations to return to identical positions when accounting for multiple celestial cycles interacting. 43,200 years roughly corresponds to periods involving nodal precession of the moon's orbit combined with solar precession. The antediluvian kings might represent named epochs during which particular astronomical arrangements prevailed. But this interpretation introduces its own problem. It requires ancient observers to track celestial movements for periods far exceeding any individual lifetime, any dynasty, any civilization as we understand it. It requires institutional continuity, spanning thousands of years, meticulous record-keeping across generations, and mathematical sophistication to calculate cycles from accumulated observations. It requires, in essence, exactly the kind of long-duration civilization the King List claims existed before the flood. The document thus creates a paradox. If we accepted the numbers as mythological, we must explain why they're mathematically structured according to astronomical principles. If we accept them as astronomical records, we must explain who maintained observations for tens of thousands of years. Either interpretation suggests knowledge that shouldn't exist in the early Bronze Age, unless that knowledge wasn't generated then, but preserved from earlier times. The flood itself, positioned as the Great Discontinuity, appears in identical contexts across cultures. The Hindu accounts place a catastrophic deluge at the boundary between cosmic ages. Greek tradition records Deucalion's flood destroying the Age of Bronze. Mesoamerican codices describe world-ending waters between cosmic epochs. In every case, the flood marks not just environmental catastrophe, but temporal division, the end of one system of measurement and the beginning of another. If the antediluvian chronology records something real, whether dynasties, astronomical cycles, or some other form of time measurement, then the flood represents the moment when that system broke. The post-flood kings reign for periods that gradually approach historical norms, as if record-keeping itself had to be rebuilt from fragments. The early post-flood numbers might represent partial memories, approximations, best estimates made by survivors who knew the system existed but couldn't fully reconstruct it. The King List, then, might be recording not myth, but memory, compressed, translated, and preserved by scribes who no longer fully understood what they copied, but recognized its importance. The impossibly long reigns wouldn't be inventions, but artifacts of a measurement system that ceased to function after the flood, leaving only numbers whose meaning had been partially lost. And if this is true, the document serves as evidence for what it claims: a world before the flood that possessed knowledge sufficient to track cosmic time, a catastrophe that destroyed that world, and a post-catastrophe civilization that inherited fragments of chronology without fully understanding their origin. The King List isn't just describing what came before. It's demonstrating that something came before, something sophisticated enough to measure time in units we're only now learning to recognize. More than 200 cultures across 6 continents preserve accounts of a catastrophic flood that destroyed the previous world. They are not variations on a single story spread through contact. They are independent narratives, recorded in isolation, describing the same event with identical structural elements: rising waters, divine warning, chosen survivors, vessels of salvation, and the preservation of sacred knowledge. The consistency is not literary, it is memorial. The Mesopotamian account, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes Utnapishtim receiving warning of coming inundation. He constructs a vessel, seals it with pitch, loads it with animals and craftsmen possessing essential knowledge, and survives while the world drowns. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find land. The story is familiar because later traditions echo it. But the Gilgamesh text dates to 2100 BC, making it among the earliest written versions. The story it tells is explicitly described as ancient even then, knowledge passed from the world before. Hindu texts preserve the Matsya Purana, in which Manu receives warning from a divine fish. He builds a ship, survives the deluge, and becomes the progenitor of the new humanity. The Satapatha Brahmana provides additional detail. The flood came as punishment for corruption. Only the pure survived, and they carried with them the sacred knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization. The texts specify that 7 sages, the Saptarishi, accompanied Manu, each preserving different aspects of wisdom. Chinese tradition records the Great Flood during the reign of Emperor Yao, approximately 2300 BC. The waters rose for generations, destroying cities and driving populations to mountain peaks. The hero Gun attempted to contain the flood by building dikes, but failed. His son Yu succeeded by dredging channels and controlling water flow, suggesting engineering knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. The account describes a world-altering catastrophe requiring decades to overcome, after which civilization had to be reorganized. In the Americas, flood narratives appear from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, with no possibility of Old World contamination. The Ojibwe describe Nanabojo surviving on a raft, sending animals to dive for soil to rebuild land. The Aztec Codex Chimalpopoca records 4 previous worlds, each destroyed by catastrophe, with the 4th ending in flood. The Inca preserved accounts of Viracocha emerging from Lake Titicaca after waters destroyed the previous age, bringing knowledge of agriculture and architecture to survivors in the highlands. Pacific Island traditions across Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia describe primordial flooding that submerged ancestral homelands, forcing populations to seek higher ground or voyage to distant islands. The Maori of New Zealand tell of Tauhaki surviving the deluge. Hawaiian tradition preserves the story of Nu'u, who built a vessel and survived rising waters. These accounts developed in complete isolation from continental civilizations, yet describe the same pattern: warning, survival, preservation, rebuilding. The shared elements across these narratives exceed coincidental similarity. They describe not just flooding, but specific sequences: warning from divine or natural sources, construction of vessels, preservation of animals and knowledge keepers, testing for land's return, and post-flood re-establishment of civilization. These details suggest transmission of actual events rather than archetypal storytelling. Myths created independently don't share procedural specifics. Memories do. Geological evidence confirms that catastrophic flooding occurred during the period these traditions reference. Between 11,600 and 1000 BC, global sea levels rose approximately 120 meters as glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age. This wasn't gradual. Ice core data from Greenland reveals periods of rapid rise, pulses during which ocean levels increase several meters within decades. Coastal populations would have experienced not slow encroachment, but sudden inundation. The regions affected correspond precisely to areas where human populations concentrated during the Ice Age. Doggerland, the landmass connecting Britain to continental Europe, supported extensive human habitation evidenced by tools, weapons, and animal remains recovered from the North Sea floor. This territory, larger than modern Britain, vanished beneath the waves between 8500 and 6500 BC. Any settlements there disappeared completely. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia presents an even more dramatic loss. During the Ice Age, sea levels exposed a continental shelf the size of India, connecting Indonesia, Malaysia, and mainland Southeast Asia into a single landmass. This region, called Sundaland, offered tropical climate, rich resources, and optimal conditions for human civilization. As seas rose, the entire region flooded, submerging an area of approximately 1.8 million square kilometers. If civilizations existed there, their remains lie beneath 40 to 120 meters of water. The Persian Gulf Basin follows the same pattern. Geological surveys reveal that during the Ice Age, the Gulf was a river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and a fourth river system that no longer exists above water. This valley, fertile, well-watered, and protected by surrounding highlands, would have been ideal for human settlement. Marine core samples from the Gulf floor show pollen from cultivated plants in layers dating to 7500 BC, indicating organized agriculture in the region before it flooded. By 6000 BC, the entire valley lay submerged. Underwater archaeological surveys have begun revealing what was lost. Off the coast of India, near Gujarat, sonar mapping detected geometric structures at depths corresponding to habitation during lower sea levels. Near Yonaguni, Japan, carved formations show right angles and parallel lines inconsistent with natural geology. In the Mediterranean, submerged ruins appear off multiple coastlines at depths matching Ice Age sea levels. These findings remain controversial, but they demonstrate that extensive landscapes suitable for habitation now lie underwater, and that not everything has been discovered. The flood narratives consistently reference preservation of knowledge through catastrophe. Utnapishtim saved craftsmen and scribes. Manu traveled with 7 sages. The Chinese account emphasizes that Yu's success required engineering understanding. These aren't incidental details. They indicate awareness that a civilization depended not just on surviving physically, but on preserving information, agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, architectural principles, mathematical systems. The stories describe conscious efforts to save knowledge, suggesting the cultures being destroyed possessed sophisticated understanding worth preserving. This raises the central question: if flooding destroyed coastal civilizations between 11,600 and 6,000 BC, and if survivors carried fragments of knowledge to higher ground, would the archaeological record show sudden appearance of advanced capabilities in inland regions shortly thereafter? It would show exactly what we find: settlements in Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, and highland Mesoamerica displaying sophisticated knowledge without clear local developmental sequences. The flood survivors wouldn't be starting from zero. They'd be rebuilding from memory. The king list's division between antediluvian and post-diluvian periods aligns precisely with this geological chronology. If the antediluvian section records a civilization inhabiting the Persian Gulf Valley before 6000 BC, and if that civilization was destroyed by flooding, the sudden appearance of Sumerian sophistication becomes comprehensible. It's not innovation, it's restoration. Knowledge preserved through catastrophe and reapplied once conditions stabilized. The flood narratives themselves provide the transmission mechanism. They're not explaining why floods happen. They're describing how knowledge survives catastrophe, through chosen keepers, through vessels containing preserved wisdom, through survivors who remember enough to rebuild. The stories are instructions disguised as myth, templates for civilizational continuity in the face of destruction. And if this interpretation holds, then every ancient culture preserving flood traditions isn't remembering the same myth. They're remembering the same event, the moment when rising waters destroyed the previous world, when knowledge keepers fled to surviving lands, when humanity had to reconstruct civilization from fragments of what had been lost. The consistency across continents doesn't indicate shared storytelling. It indicates shared experience, preserved through millennia as the most important memory a culture could transmit. The warning that the world has ended before and will again. The waters rose, the old world drowned. Some knowledge survived. This isn't mythology. It's history we forgot was real. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, carved pillars weighing up to 16 tons stand in precise circular arrangements, aligned to celestial events occurring thousands of years in the future. The site dates to 9600 BC, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids. It was built by people who, according to conventional chronology, had barely discovered agriculture. Yet the monument encodes astronomical knowledge that requires centuries of systematic observation to acquire. Whoever built this didn't just understand the sky, they understood time. The problem isn't that Göbekli Tepe exists. The problem is what it knows. 20 circular enclosures have been discovered so far, arranged in a complex that covers approximately 22 acres. Each enclosure contains massive T-shaped pillars carved from limestone, quarried half a kilometer away. The pillars feature elaborate reliefs, animals, geometric patterns, humanoid figures, executed with artistic sophistication that suggests established iconographic traditions. But it's the positioning of the pillars that reveals the true purpose. The enclosures align to specific astronomical events. Enclosure D orients to the setting point of the star Deneb in 9500 BC. Other structures mark the summer solstice sunrise, the equinox positions, and the heliacal rising of Sirius. These aren't approximate alignments. They're precise calculations requiring knowledge of the horizon, understanding of stellar precession, and awareness that celestial positions change over long periods. The builders weren't recording what they saw in their lifetime. They were recording cycles that spanned millennia. Carbon dating confirms the site's age. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material from the lowest levels consistently returns dates between 9600 and 9000 BC. This places construction during the pre-pottery Neolithic period, an era when humans supposedly lived in small, nomadic bands, subsisting on wild plants and animals. Yet, Göbekli Tepe required organizational capabilities on par with later civilizations. Coordinated labor from hundreds of workers, specialized craftsmen to carve the pillars, engineers to calculate alignments, and provisioning systems to feed the construction crews. The site suggests social complexity that shouldn't exist for another 5,000 years. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened to Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BC. It was deliberately buried. The enclosures were carefully filled with debris and soil, preserving them perfectly. This wasn't natural abandonment, it was intentional entombment, as if the builders wanted to protect the site from destruction, or hide knowledge from a coming catastrophe. The timing corresponds with the period of rapid sea level rise, when coastal civilizations were being destroyed by flooding. Someone went to enormous effort to ensure these astronomical records survived. Nabta Playa in southern Egypt reveals a similar pattern of impossible sophistication appearing far earlier than it should. Located in the Nubian desert, the site contains stone circles dating to 16500 BC, making them 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. The circles consist of megaliths arranged to track the summer solstice and cardinal directions. But the precision exceeds simple solar observation. The arrangement of stones corresponds to the position of specific stars, particularly the Belt of Orion, as they appeared in the sky around 6500 BC. Modern astronomical software can reconstruct ancient skies and verify these alignments. The correlation is exact. This means the builders of Nabta Playa possessed not just observational astronomy, but mathematical ability to calculate stellar positions and translate them into ground layouts. They were making star maps in stone 3,000 years before Egypt built pyramids. The purpose becomes clearer when comparing Nabta Playa's layout to later Egyptian monuments. The arrangement of the stone circles mirrors the positioning of the three main pyramids at Giza, which in turn reflect Orion's belt. The correlation suggests continuity, that the knowledge encoded at Nabta Playa was transmitted to and incorporated into later Egyptian civilization. The desert site functions as an archive, preserving astronomical information across millennia until it could be retrieved and applied. Stonehenge in England, dating to 3000 BC, demonstrates even more sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The monument tracks not just solar and lunar cycles, but the 56-year eclipse prediction cycle, known as the Saros cycle. The 56 Aubrey holes that form Stonehenge's outer circle enable calculation of when eclipses will occur, a feat requiring decades of observation and mathematical analysis. The alignment also incorporates the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, which tracks the moon's maximum and minimum rising and setting positions. Predicting this cycle demands multi-generational record-keeping and understanding of celestial mechanics. The engineering itself challenges conventional capabilities. The sarsen stones, weighing up to 50 tons, were transported from quarries 25 kilometers away. The blue stones, weighing up to 4 tons each, came from Wales, 240 kilometers distant. Moving these stones without wheels, metal tools, or draft animals represents a logistics problem that modern engineers struggle to solve, even with current technology. Yet, Neolithic builders accomplished it, positioned the stones with millimeter precision, and created alignments that remain accurate thousands of years later. Similar megalithic sites appear globally, separated by oceans and continents, yet displaying identical concerns: astronomical alignment, massive stone construction, and mathematical precision. The temple complexes of Malta, dating to 3600 BC, align to equinoxes and solstices while incorporating acoustic properties that amplify specific frequencies. The Karnak stones in France, erected around 4500 BC, stretch for kilometers in alignments pointing to celestial events. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3200 BC, features a roof box that admits sunlight into the central chamber only during winter solstice sunrise, requiring precise calculation of solar angle and chamber depth. In the Americas, sites separated from Old World influence show the same patterns. Chanquillo in Peru, dating to 300 BC, consists of 13 towers that mark the sun's position throughout the year, enabling creation of an accurate solar calendar. The alignment precision matches that of Stonehenge. The Hopewell earthworks in Ohio, constructed around 100 AD, incorporate astronomical alignments to the 18.6-year lunar cycle, identical to those at Stonehenge, yet were built by cultures with no known contact. The global distribution of these sites raises questions that conventional diffusion models cannot answer. If astronomical knowledge developed independently in each location, why do the monuments encode the same celestial cycles? Why do they use the same mathematical relationships? Why do they demonstrate equivalent levels of precision despite separation by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years? The alternative interpretation, that these sites reflect transmission of a common astronomical framework, requires accepting something more troubling: that organized knowledge preservation systems existed far earlier than civilization supposedly began. Systems capable of maintaining observational records across centuries, calculating complex celestial mechanics, and transmitting information through architectural encoding. Systems that treated stone not as building material, but as permanent memory. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe suggests those who built these monuments understood their knowledge was vulnerable. They encoded it in the most durable medium available, massive stone structures that could survive environmental catastrophe, cultural collapse, and millennia of abandonment. The alignments themselves served as self-verifying information. Future observers could check the astronomical correlations and confirm the builder's understanding was accurate. The monuments weren't just temples. They were libraries designed to outlast their creators. This explains the mathematical precision. If the goal was preserving knowledge through potential catastrophe, the information had to be encoded accurately enough that survivors could recover it. The alignments had to remain verifiable across thousands of years. The measurements had to reflect real celestial mechanics, not symbolic approximations. The monuments had to function as teaching tools, demonstrating through their very structure that advanced astronomical understanding existed and could be reacquired. What these sites collectively demonstrate is not primitive peoples occasionally noticing the sun's position, but sophisticated civilizations deliberately preserving scientific knowledge in permanent form. They understood that organic records, tablets, texts, spoken traditions could be destroyed. Stone endures. And in that stone, they carved not just images, but data. The lengths of celestial cycles, the positions of stars across millennia, the mathematical relationships governing cosmic motion. The sky changes slowly. The stone remains. And encoded in that stone is evidence that someone, long before history remembers, was watching carefully enough to understand patterns that repeat over thousands of years. They didn't just see the sky, they measured it, calculated it, and preserved those calculations for whoever would come after. The question isn't whether they possessed this knowledge. the monuments prove they did. The question is, who taught them to look up, and what else did they know that we've yet to decode from the stones they left behind? Sumerian texts describe 7 figures called the Apkallu, sages who existed before the flood and taught humanity the fundamentals of civilization. They are not presented as mythological gods, but as historical individuals with specific roles. Huana taught writing, Huanaduga taught metalworking, Enmeduga taught irrigation. The texts record their names, their functions, and the knowledge they preserved. Then the flood came, and the Apkallu vanished. But what they taught remained, transmitted through priesthoods that claimed direct lineage from these antediluvian teachers. These weren't legends invented to explain civilization's origin. They were institutional claims to inherited authority. The concept of knowledge keepers appears across every ancient culture with remarkable consistency. Egypt had the Shemsu Hor, followers of Horus, described in the Turin King list as divine beings who ruled for thousands of years before mortal dynasties. Hindu tradition preserves the Saptarishi, 7 sages who survived the cosmic flood and carried the Vedas through cycles of destruction and creation. Greek sources reference Egyptian priests who claimed their astronomical records extended back 36,000 years, maintained by unbroken priestly succession. What unites these traditions is function. The deliberate preservation of knowledge through catastrophe by specialized classes trained to memorize, encode, and transmit information across generations. These weren't simply religious authorities. They were human archives, living libraries tasked with ensuring that if civilization collapsed, the blueprint for rebuilding would survive. The mechanisms they used reveal sophisticated understanding of how information persists when material culture fails. Oral tradition served as the primary storage medium, but not in the casual sense of storytelling. Vedic priests developed mnemonic systems that enabled word-perfect transmission of thousands of verses across millennia. The Rig Veda, composed around 1500 BC, has been transmitted orally with such precision that modern linguists can trace pronunciation shifts over 3,000 years. This level of accuracy requires systematic training, institutional continuity, and recognition that exact preservation matters. Ritual served as reinforcement mechanism. By embedding knowledge in repeated ceremonial actions, priests ensured transmission even if understanding was lost. The performance itself became the memory. Egyptian temple rituals involving astronomical observations, performed daily for thousands of years, preserved understanding of celestial cycles regardless of whether individual priests comprehended the mathematics involved. The ritual was the record. Sacred architecture functioned as the most permanent encoding method. The dimensions, proportions, and alignments of temples and monuments contained mathematical and astronomical information that couldn't be forgotten, because it was literally built into structures designed to last millennia. The Great Pyramid's dimensions encode the proportions of Earth's northern hemisphere. Its internal passages align to specific stars. Even if all written records were destroyed, the knowledge remained accessible to anyone who knew how to read the architecture. This encoding wasn't symbolic in the modern sense, using arbitrary signs to represent concepts. It was mathematical. The physical structure demonstrated the knowledge through its proportions and functions. Someone measuring the pyramid would discover pi Phi, and the dimensions of Earth, whether or not they understood the original builder's intent. The monument served as self-teaching device. The Dendera zodiac from Egypt's Ptolemaic period depicts the night sky as it appeared around 10,500 BC, thousands of years before the temple containing it was built. The astronomical positions shown require either direct observation from that era or precise calculation of precession to reconstruct ancient skies. Either interpretation suggests the temple priests possessed or maintained records spanning 8,000 years. They weren't creating new knowledge. They were preserving old knowledge by continuously updating its presentation. Sumerian and Babylonian priesthoods maintained similar continuity. The astronomical diaries kept by Babylonian priests, fragments of which survive from the 8th century BC onward, contain observations with precision matching modern measurements. But the texts themselves reference earlier observations going back centuries, suggesting the recording program was far older than surviving examples. The priests weren't casual stargazers. They were institutional observers maintaining multi-generational research programs. Indian astronomical texts contain measurements that should be impossible without modern instruments. The Surya Siddhanta, committed to writing around 400 AD, but claiming much older origins, calculates Earth's diameter to within 50 miles of the correct value, gives the distance to the Moon with 98% accuracy, and describes the gravitational effects that keep celestial bodies in orbit. The text presents this as ancient knowledge being recorded, not contemporary discovery. The priestly class transmitted this information through centuries of political upheaval, invasion, and cultural transformation, because they understood their role as custodians rather than innovators. The function of myth becomes clearer when viewed through this lens. Stories of gods teaching humanity aren't primitive explanations for civilization's origin. They're compressed records of knowledge transmission. When Egyptian texts describe Thoth teaching writing and mathematics, they're preserving institutional memory of when these technologies were introduced, and acknowledging that the source predated Egyptian civilization itself. The divine attribution marks the knowledge as inherited rather than invented. The flood narratives consistently emphasize this preservation function. Utnapishtim doesn't just save animals. He saves craftsmen and knowledge holders. Manu travels with 7 sages, each carrying different categories of wisdom. The Chinese account of Yu emphasizes that stopping the flood required engineering knowledge. These stories encode the principle that survival depends not just on physical endurance, but on preserving information necessary for rebuilding. The number 7 appears repeatedly across these traditions. 7 Apkallu, 7 Saptarishi, 7 sages with Manu. This isn't coincidental symbolism. 7 represents the minimum number of specialists needed to preserve comprehensive knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine, architecture, and writing. The stories preserve not just that knowledge was saved, but the organizational structure required to save it. Egyptian initiation practices reveal how this knowledge was protected. Priests underwent decades of training before accessing the highest temple secrets. The progression moved from memorizing rituals to understanding their astronomical and mathematical foundations to learning the symbolic encoding systems that preserved knowledge across generations. Only those who completed the full curriculum gained access to the complete framework. This ensured that even if lower-level knowledge was lost during catastrophe, the highest initiates could reconstruct it. The priesthoods didn't just preserve knowledge, they preserved the methods for recovering knowledge. They understood that specific information might be lost, but taught systems for regenerating it. If astronomical records were destroyed, their students knew how to restart observation programs. If mathematical texts were lost, they could rebuild the frameworks from architectural examples. The monuments and rituals served as backup systems, ensuring redundancy. This explains the mathematical precision encoded in ancient structures and the exact astronomical alignments maintained across millennia. These weren't religious preferences, they were verification systems. Future keepers could check the alignments against actual celestial positions and confirm the knowledge was accurate. The monuments functioned as calibration standards, preserving measurement systems that outlasted the cultures that built them. The keeper traditions also explain why similar knowledge appears in geographically separated cultures. If survivors of a flood-destroyed civilization dispersed to different regions, each group would carry fragments of the original knowledge. Egyptian, Sumerian, and Indian priesthoods might represent parallel lineages descending from a common source, each preserving portions of a larger system. The overlapping astronomical knowledge, the identical numerical patterns, and the shared concern with preservation suggest not independent invention, but branching transmission. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of deliberate systematic knowledge preservation operating across cultures and millennia. The keepers weren't mythological figures. They were real institutional roles, training successive generations to memorize, encode, and transmit information deemed essential for civilization's continuity. They understood that catastrophe could erase material culture, but that knowledge encoded in memory, ritual, and stone could survive if someone dedicated themselves to maintaining it. The ancient texts describing these keeper traditions aren't claiming divine inspiration. They're documenting succession, recording that the knowledge they possess came from earlier sources, that their role is preservation rather than creation, and that their authority derives from maintaining continuity with what existed before. When Egyptian priests told Greek historians their records extended back tens of thousands of years, they weren't exaggerating. They were reporting institutional memory maintained through the only system capable of preserving information across such spans: human dedication to remembering. The keepers existed because someone understood that civilizations end, but knowledge doesn't have to. They encoded what they knew in every durable form available: memory, ritual, architecture, myth, and trained successors to recognize, interpret, and transmit these encodings. They weren't preserving religion, they were preserving science, compressed into forms that could survive the collapse of the world that created it. And in the continuity of these priestly lineages, in the precision of their astronomical observations, in the mathematical perfection of their monuments, we see evidence that they succeeded. The knowledge survived. The question is, how much of what they preserved do we still not understand? Between 10,800 and 9,600 BC, something happened to Earth's climate that rewrote the conditions for human survival. Ice cores from Greenland show temperature increases of 15 degrees Fahrenheit occurring within a single decade. Geological layers reveal flooding on scales that would submerge entire regions within 1 generations. Extinction rates spike. pollen records indicate massive vegetation shifts. Then, in the archaeological record, something else appears. Silence. Not the gradual decline of cultures, but wholesale disappearance, as if populations that had existed for millennia simply vanished, leaving only scattered remnants. This wasn't gradual climate change, it was catastrophic reset. The Younger Dryas period, lasting from 10,900 to 9,700 BC, represents one of the most dramatic climate events in recent geological history. Global temperatures plummeted suddenly, reversing the warming trend that had been melting glaciers. Then, just as abruptly, temperatures spiked upward. The rapidity of these shifts, occurring within human lifetimes, would have devastated any civilization dependent on stable climate, predictable seasons, and established agricultural zones. Evidence from multiple sources confirms the scale of disruption. Meltwater pulse 1b, occurring around 9,500 BC, raised global sea levels by 10 to 15 meters within a century. Coastal regions inhabited during the Ice Age disappeared beneath the waves. The fertile river valleys that had supported populations for millennia became ocean floor. Any settlements, monuments, or records located in these regions vanished completely, preserved only if survivors carried memories to higher ground. The Greenland ice cores reveal something more disturbing. Layers corresponding to 10,900 BC contain elevated concentrations of platinum, iridium, and nano-diamonds, signatures consistent with extraterrestrial impact. The Younger Dryas boundary layer shows evidence of widespread biomass burning across North America and Europe. Whether caused by comet fragments, volcanic eruptions, or other mechanisms, something triggered sudden environmental catastrophe on a continental scale. Human populations contracted dramatically during this period. Genetic studies reveal bottlenecks, sharp reductions in population diversity, occurring around 11,000 BC. Archaeological sites occupied for millennia show abandonment. Tool technologies that had been refined over thousands of years disappear from the record. The continuity of material culture breaks. When populations reappear centuries later, they often display less sophisticated technologies than their predecessors, as if knowledge had been lost and was being slowly reacquired. The pattern repeats across continents. In North America, the Clovis culture, characterized by distinctive spear points and widespread distribution, vanishes around 10,900 BC, coinciding with megafauna extinctions. In Europe, settlements concentrated in river valleys during the Ice Age show abandonment as sea levels rise and climate destabilizes. In the Middle East, early agricultural sites dating to 10,500 BC appear suddenly, suggesting populations displaced from now submerged coastal regions, bringing knowledge of cultivation to interior highlands. What survives reveals what was lost. Göbekli Tepe, constructed around 9,600 BC, immediately following the Younger Dryas, demonstrates architectural and astronomical sophistication, suggesting inherited knowledge rather than recent invention. The site appears not as humanity's first monumental construction, but as a desperate attempt to preserve knowledge from a collapsing world. The deliberate burial of the complex around 8,000 BC suggests continued environmental instability and possible recognition that further catastrophe might be coming. The myths encoding flood narratives consistently describe knowledge preservation as the primary concern of survivors. Utnapishtim saves craftsmen. Manu travels with sages. The Egyptian Edfu texts describe survivors of the destroyed first time, establishing new temples to preserve astronomical knowledge. These aren't incidental details. They indicate that ancient cultures understood catastrophe threatened not just physical survival, but informational continuity, and that deliberate efforts were required to prevent total amnesia. The fragments that survived reveal the magnitude of what was lost. Sumerian civilization appears around 3300 BC, with fully formed writing, mathematics, and astronomy, but no local developmental sequence. Egyptian civilization emerges around 3100 BC, with sophisticated understanding of geometry, astronomy, and engineering encoded in its earliest monuments. The Indus Valley civilization materializes around 3300 BC, with planned cities, standardized measurements, and drainage systems appearing without precedent. Each displays characteristics of inherited rather than invented knowledge. The numerical systems preserved across cultures provide the clearest evidence of transmission from earlier sources. The base 60 mathematics appearing in Sumerian texts, the precessional numbers encoded in Hindu chronologies, the astronomical constants embedded in Mayan calendars, all suggest preservation of frameworks developed over thousands of years of observation. But the civilizations preserving these numbers emerged relatively recently. Someone else must have developed the original observational programs. Architecture serves as the most durable archive. The alignment of monuments to celestial positions that existed thousands of years before their construction demonstrates that builders possessed or inherited knowledge of precession. The mathematical relationships encoded in pyramid dimensions, temple proportions, and megalithic spacing preserve information that survives the loss of all written records. Even if every text were destroyed, the monuments could teach survivors about astronomical cycles, mathematical constants, and engineering principles, exactly the knowledge necessary to restart civilization. Oral tradition functioned as backup system. The Vedic texts, transmitted orally with word-perfect accuracy for thousands of years, preserve astronomical data from epochs predating their written form. Aboriginal Australian traditions encode geological information about coastlines and sea levels from periods when land now underwater was accessible. These traditions suggest recognition that memory could survive when material culture failed, if knowledge was embedded in ritual, song, and narrative, maintained through institutional training. The keeper classes described in ancient texts make sense within this context. If catastrophe had destroyed earlier civilizations, survivors would recognize the need for specialized custodians, groups dedicated to preserving knowledge across potential future collapses. The priesthoods claiming descent from antediluvian sages weren't inventing mythology. They were maintaining institutional identity as keepers of inherited knowledge, preserving information they understood had survived previous catastrophes and might need to survive future ones. The pattern suggests civilization doesn't progress linearly, but operates cyclically, rising to levels of sophistication sufficient to track cosmic time and encode knowledge permanently, then collapsing due to environmental catastrophe, with survivors preserving fragments that enable faster reconstruction than starting from zero. Each cycle inherits from the previous, building on foundations that may extend back through multiple rises and falls. This model explains the archaeological anomalies. Sophisticated knowledge appearing without developmental sequences, because the development occurred in previous cycles now largely erased from the record. It explains the global distribution of similar astronomical frameworks, because survivors of the last major collapse dispersed to different regions carrying fragments of a common knowledge base. It explains the obsessive concern with preservation in stone and ritual, because keepers understood from experience that everything else could be lost. The silence in the archaeological record between 10,800 and 9,600 BC isn't absence of human activity, it's absence of preserved evidence, destroyed by rising seas, buried under sediment, or lost when populations collapsed below the threshold necessary to maintain material culture. What survived did so, because survivors made deliberate choices about what to preserve and how to encode it in forms that could outlast catastrophe. The re-emergence of civilization after this period wasn't humanity's first achievement, it was reconstruction. Fragments of memory, scattered survivors, inherited techniques, and preserved astronomical data being recombined in new cultural forms adapted to changed conditions. The sudden sophistication isn't miraculous. It's expected when knowledge survives, even if populations don't. And if this interpretation holds, the question shifts from how did primitive peoples develop civilization so quickly to how many times has this happened before? How many cycles of rise and collapse preceded the one we remember? How much knowledge encoded in monuments, myths, and numbers represents inheritance from worlds so ancient their existence survives only as mathematical ghosts, constants and cycles preserved through catastrophes that erased everything else? The ice cores show it happened. The genetic data confirm population collapse. The geological evidence proves massive environmental disruption. The myths describe exactly this sequence: advanced civilization, catastrophe, survival of knowledge keepers, rebuilding from fragments. The monuments demonstrate astronomical knowledge requiring millennia to develop, appearing in cultures that emerged recently. Every line of evidence points to the same conclusion. Civilization has forgotten itself before, perhaps many times, and what we call the beginning is really just the most recent restart. The forgetting wasn't complete. It never is. Some knowledge always survives, carried in the minds of keepers, encoded in monuments, compressed into myths, calculated in numbers that describe cosmic time. The question isn't whether knowledge was lost, it's whether we've yet recovered everything that was preserved, whether we recognize the encoded information surrounding us, and whether we'll remember the warnings before the cycle repeats again. The Great Pyramid sits silent in the desert, encoding mathematical constants that wouldn't be formally discovered until the 18th century. Stonehenge marks celestial cycles, requiring centuries of observation to detect. The Sumerian king list records time in measurements we've only recently learned to recognize. These aren't monuments to gods or kings. They're messages, warnings preserved in the only medium guaranteed to outlast the civilizations that built them. And we've spent most of human history not understanding what they were trying to say. The ancient world wasn't documenting the past. It was anticipating the future. Every culture that achieved sufficient sophistication to track cosmic time, to encode knowledge in permanent form, to establish keeper classes dedicated to preservation, every single one included in its core traditions the same warning: this has happened before, and it will happen again. Not as religious prophecy, but as observed pattern. They watched civilizations rise and collapse. They preserved fragments through catastrophe. They rebuilt from inherited knowledge. And they encoded in every durable medium available the single most important message they possessed: progress without memory leads to repetition. The cycle they described isn't metaphorical. It's observable in the geological record, confirmed in ice cores, visible in genetic bottlenecks. Climate catastrophe destroys coastal civilizations. Survivors carry fragments of knowledge to higher ground. Populations rebuild using inherited techniques they no longer fully understand. New cultures emerge, displaying sophisticated capabilities without developmental sequences. These cultures eventually achieve stability sufficient to begin their own observation programs, only to discover that the numbers they're calculating match numbers encoded in ruins predating their civilization by millennia. They realize they're not the first. This recognition appears to trigger a specific response across cultures: the establishment of preservation systems, not just recording current knowledge, but encoding it in forms designed to survive the next collapse. The monuments become increasingly permanent, progressing from wood to stone to precisely aligned megaliths. The knowledge becomes increasingly abstract, moving from practical techniques to mathematical constants that enable regeneration of lost capabilities. The keeper classes become increasingly rigorous, requiring decades of training to access the highest understanding. Every aspect of the system optimizes for informational survival through catastrophe. The question is, what did they know that made them so certain catastrophe was coming? The myths don't describe natural disasters as random events. They describe them as consequences, results of imbalance, corruption, or forgetting fundamental principles. The flood comes when humanity loses connection to divine order, when knowledge becomes corrupted, when technological capability exceeds moral wisdom. The language is mythological, but the pattern it describes is systemic. Civilizations that advance technologically without corresponding advancement in wisdom become unstable and collapse. Modern archaeology increasingly confirms this pattern. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC saw interconnected civilizations across the Mediterranean simultaneously failing, not from single cause, but from cascading systems' failure as trade networks broke, climate shifted, and populations migrated. The classic Maya collapse around 900 AD followed similar patterns. Sophisticated civilization with impressive astronomical knowledge, failing when environmental pressures exceeded systemic resilience. Rome, with its advanced engineering and continental administration, fractured when complexity outpaced adaptive capacity. Each collapse shares common features: centralization, creating vulnerability; specialization, preventing adaptation; complexity, requiring resources that become unavailable; and loss of resilience as systems optimize for stability rather than flexibility. The civilizations that survived weren't necessarily the most advanced. They were the ones that maintained redundancy, preserved fundamental knowledge, and didn't over-specialize to the point where disruption became catastrophic. The ancient warnings weren't about specific disasters. They were about the conditions that make civilizations vulnerable. Don't forget where knowledge came from. Don't abandon the preservation systems. Don't let technological capability exceed understanding of consequences. Don't optimize so completely for current conditions that adaptation becomes impossible. These principles appear consistently in texts describing pre-catastrophe periods. The antediluvian world possessed great knowledge, but forgot why that knowledge mattered beyond immediate application. What makes this relevant now is the pattern we're currently following. Modern civilization possesses technological capabilities unprecedented in recorded history. We've achieved things the ancient world encoded as distant possibilities, splitting atoms, leaving the planet, manipulating genetics, creating artificial intelligence. Our observational instruments exceed ancient naked eye astronomy by factors of millions. Our mathematical frameworks model reality at scales from quantum to cosmic. Our computational capacity enables calculations that would have required thousands of years using ancient methods. But we've lost continuity with the preservation systems. We've forgotten that knowledge needs encoding in forms that survive technological collapse. Our information storage depends on systems requiring continuous power, manufacturing capability, and institutional stability. A single generation without these systems would lose access to most of recorded knowledge. We've optimized for immediate retrieval rather than long-term preservation. Exactly the opposite priority of the ancient keeper classes. The astronomical data provides the most unsettling parallel. Ancient cultures tracked precessional cycles lasting 26,000 years because they understood human timescales were insufficient for measuring cosmic patterns. They embedded these measurements in monuments designed to last tens of thousands of years. Modern civilization tracks climate change, resource depletion, and systemic risks, but our planning horizons rarely extend beyond decades. We possess superior measurement capability, but inferior temporal perspective. The warnings preserved in myth consistently emphasize this temporal mismatch. Civilizations collapse when they lose ability to perceive slow-moving changes. The antediluvian world, according to these traditions, possessed great knowledge, but failed to recognize destabilizing patterns until catastrophe became unavoidable. The survivors encoded warnings specifically about this failure, not just recording that collapse happened, but explaining why, the lost capacity to perceive long-term consequence. Current trends mirror the pre-collapse conditions described in ancient texts with disturbing precision, increasing complexity, creating systemic vulnerabilities, specialization preventing adaptation, centralization amplifying failure cascades, growing disconnect between technological capability and understanding of consequences, optimization for current conditions, reducing resilience to disruption. These aren't moral judgments, they're systemic observations, the same patterns visible in archaeological sequences preceding major civilizational collapses. The ancient world's response to recognizing these patterns was deliberate preservation. They created redundancy, encoding knowledge in monuments, ritual, oral tradition, and text. They established keeper classes, maintaining information across generations. They prioritized long-term survival of understanding over short-term efficiency of retrieval. They treated knowledge preservation as existential necessity rather than academic exercise. Modern civilization has made opposite choices. We've centralized information storage in systems requiring continuous maintenance. We've optimized for immediate access rather than long-term durability. We've specialized to to the point where understanding of fundamental principles has become rare. We've treated knowledge as abundant resource rather than fragile inheritance, requiring active preservation. And we've largely dismissed the warnings encoded in ancient traditions as primitive mythology rather than recognizing them as compressed observation from cultures that watched this pattern play out before. The question isn't whether ancient civilizations possessed capabilities we've forgotten. The monuments and mathematical precision demonstrate they did. The question is whether we'll recognize the pattern they observed before we repeat their trajectory. They encoded warnings in every durable form available. They established preservation systems designed to outlast catastrophe. They created keeper traditions, maintaining knowledge across collapses. And they consistently emphasized the same message: progress without wisdom, capability without understanding, advancement without preservation. These conditions precede collapse. We possess unprecedented ability to verify what they encoded. Satellite archaeology reveals submerged structures along continental shelves. Ice cores confirm rapid climate shifts. Astronomical software reconstructs ancient skies and validates their alignments. Genetic studies trace human migrations matching flood narratives. Every tool we've developed to understand the past increasingly confirms what the ancients preserved. Civilization has risen and fallen in cycles. Knowledge has survived catastrophe through deliberate preservation. And the pattern repeats when subsequent cultures achieve sophistication without recognizing the warnings embedded in what they inherited. The ancient world didn't preserve this knowledge because they valued the past. They preserved it because they understood the future. They knew catastrophe could erase material culture, but that knowledge encoded in permanent form could survive. They knew survivors would need frameworks for rebuilding. They knew the cycle would repeat, and they encoded in stone, in mathematics, in myth, and in institutional memory everything necessary to recognize the pattern and potentially interrupt it. Whether modern civilization will recognize these warnings before history repeats itself remains the central question. Not because the ancients failed to preserve the message, but because we've spent centuries dismissing their preservation efforts as primitive superstition rather than recognizing them as sophisticated knowledge transmission from cultures that understood something. We're only beginning to rediscover that human civilization is fragile. That knowledge is harder to maintain than to lose, and that the difference between cultures that survive catastrophe and those that vanish completely is whether they remembered to encode what mattered in forms that outlast the collapse of everything else. The monuments still stand, the numbers still calculate correctly, the warnings remain encoded. The question is no longer whether ancient civilizations existed before us, but whether we will recognize their warnings before history repeats itself once again.